Imagine, if you will, that we lived in a world where we didn't understand the basis of rain, which is to say, we thought that rain was produced in the sky from the clouds on the basis of rain dances, or perhaps sacrifices to certain gods, maybe even human sacrifices. Imagine if we lived in that world. Imagine if we didn't understand that rain is produced as a consequence of clouds themselves being made up of tiny droplets of water, and when these droplets of water become too heavy, they descend onto the earth. Fairly simple, though it's a bit more complicated than that. But imagine that world. Or imagine any other scientific or meteorological phenomenon that we now understand, but at some former time in the course of our species history, we thought to be a magical phenomenon, or a phenomenon that was divine and could be placated vis-a-vis sacrifices I just mentioned. Well, in many ways, that is the world we are currently living in. And I can tell you why. I've been around on YouTube for a very long time, as most of you know, and the topic at hand goes way further back than just YouTube, namely the wage gap. Because I'll be posting this article in the low bar, as an article I recently discovered implies, not much has quote-unquote changed in the wage gap since approximately 1990. Worldwide, women only make about a third of all labor income, but that doesn't mean they work less. This number has barely changed since 1990, even though the amount of college-educated women has outstripped that of men in many countries since then. Overall, women's share of global labor income was about 30% in the early 1990s, and today it's just under 35%, according to the World Inequality 2022 report, the first report of its kind, written by leading experts on economic inequality, including Thomas Piketty, Gabriel Zucman, and Emmanuel Saez. Quote, "In a gender-equal world, women would earn 50% of all labor income," the team wrote. "In 30 years, progress has been very slow at the global level, and dynamics have been different across countries, with some recording progress, but others seeing reductions in women's share of earnings," end quote. There are a number of structural reasons for why the labor force is so gender unequal throughout the world. Sexism that keeps women from advancing in certain industries, or that shuts them out from certain careers completely. Women also perform a disproportionate amount of care work, such as for children and elderly family members, which precludes them from seeking paid jobs. And so it goes, and so it goes. You get the sense of what's going on here. And I have to ask myself why an idiot such as myself can understand that, given the complex reality we live in, a 50-50% distribution would not be the net result of that. And by that I mean there are so many variables that go into something as complicated as income globally, as complicated as wages globally, given the exigencies of our reality, given differences across countries, social strata, and so on and so forth, that I would never, ever assume that it needs to be 50-50, just because roughly half the population of the world is composed of women and half the population of men. But brilliant economists, PhDs, people far smarter than I am, technically, and smarter than the rest of us, cannot seem to grasp that. And this goes back to some really old stuff, something that Thomas Sowell had pointed out in much earlier decades, that you're not going to see a perfect one-to-one distribution of abilities, of outcomes, and basically of anything in society, given the fact that the world is complex. And there are all sorts of hidden and not so hidden reasons why things are the way they are. And so they mentioned the care work thing. Well, typically caring for family members is not remunerated. Nobody pays for that. Some people argue it should be, but it happens not to be. And as for this idea that women work the same amount of hours as men, that's simply not true. You can just go look up the stats anywhere, in almost any industry, and men, on average, and perhaps beyond average, will almost always, without exception, work more hours than women. And cumulatively, when you look across the globe, that effect will be that much more potent. And so it almost seems as if this strange, quote-unquote, inequality report of 2022, the year we're about to enter, really has no basis in reality. And on this point, I want to tie it back to this idea of praying to rain gods, right? We don't know how rain works. It has nothing to do with water droplets in the sky and has nothing to do with moisture. No, it's if you dance the right way or hit the right strings on your guitar or hit the right tones on your musical instrument to appeal to the gods. That's how rain works. And if it's not raining in a particular place, like the Atacama Desert, the driest place on Earth, that is extremely the driest desert on planet Earth in South America, in southern South America, then you need to pray to the rain gods and engage in a rain dance, and maybe even sacrifice something or someone. Well, I don't see too much of a difference here, frankly speaking. I think that like the phenomenon of rain, so too can you observe sociological phenomena such as the so-called wage gap, and you can arrive at certain conclusions that make sense from a logical perspective, having gathered sufficient data. But the reason, to my mind, why this is a recurrent theme and why this will never end, why there will always be a wage gap, is the same reason why praying to the rain god or doing a rain dance or playing instruments in order for it to rain will never bring about actual rain. If it does, it will be a pure coincidence. Because even economists are offering a magical, mystical understanding of how these things work. And beyond that, different industries are remunerated in different ways. And unfortunately, not always fairly. It's true. I'm not saying that there aren't some that are fairly remunerated, but there are some that are not. I used to work in an industry that, to my mind, was not fairly remunerated, namely translation. Translation requires an enormous amount of knowledge about both languages you're engaging in, or even more languages. You need to know the software, which requires some degree of familiarity, if not expertise. But the pay is absolute garbage, as a rule. It gets better as you advance, but it's never, ever good. And who knows why? There are all sorts of reasons and theories. This goes well beyond the scope of this video. And it is what it is, and that's the way the cookie crumbles. I should say that one of the reasons why clergy, so to speak, perhaps the priests of the rain god, encourage people to dance and play instruments in order for it to rain, and then pronounce whether or not the dance was effective based on the actual output of the clouds. They have a vested interest in staying in that position, just like a lot of these bigwigs and people who are loudly proclaiming to the world in the clouds that there's a wage gap and here are the reasons. They have an interest to stay in power too. And the problem fundamentally, again, is this can never be corrected. Praying and dancing to the rain god will never make the clouds rain. Praying and dancing around the wage gap will never fix the wage gap. Because here's the news. Men and women are different. Gods forbid that in 2022, which we're almost in, we cannot acknowledge that as a culture, as a society, as a civilization. Something that, for the record, was acknowledged for untold millennia prior. But we have whitewashed that. After all of this time, people still cannot address some fundamental problems with the silly wage gap argument, because it's not even really an argument. The most prominent argument being, if women were actually paid less for identical work compared to men, they both press the same buttons, they both do the exact same thing, if they were actually paid less for identical labor and output, there would be virtually no men employed. Why? Because every company on planet Earth would want to save money. Why would they bother employing men if they can save tons and tons of money by paying women less for identical work, that is, identical output in the work, right? That question has never been answered by these wage gap mythicists, and it never will be, because what we're really talking about is magic and religion at the end of the day. The wage gap is magic and religion, structural problems, sexism, yada, yada, yada. It never ends. And because it's a religious argument, a mystical argument, there is no solution that can actually be proposed. And so periodically, and probably for the foreseeable future until we all drop dead, we will, for the rest of our lives, have to listen to this poppycock about an eternal wage gap. It literally is just that, the eternal wage gap that will never change because magical powers have brought about an eternal wage gap that we simply cannot overcome. But if we pray to the gods enough, if we implement magical solutions, and we punish heretics who don't agree with this, and punish companies that don't toe the clerical priestly line, then we might achieve something, but it still won't be enough because it's religion. These are not logical propositions. They're not arguments. These are theological arguments. It is theology we're talking about. And we will be saddled with this BS for the rest of our lives because, frankly speaking, so much of the culture war arguments are just, at the end of the day, religious arguments. And religious arguments typically are not amenable to counter-argumentation, logic, and data. So what can you do? As always, thank you for tuning in. Hit the like button, please, if you've not yet done so. Subscribe if you are not yet a subscriber. Please hit the bell icon to be informed of my forthcoming videos. And as always, if I am still alive, I will check you out later. May the gods watch over you. May we pray to them for rain. Check you out later. Enjoy your week. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.